The polished hardwood floors of my parents' Upper East Side townhouse reflected the afternoon sunlight as I moved through a complex choreographic sequence in their spacious living room, rehearsing movements that would eventually grace stages in 37 countries and generate over $2.4 billion in ticket sales. My body flowed through jetés and pirouettes with the precision that came from years of dedication to an art form my family had never taken seriously. "Sophia, stop prancing around like a teenager," my Aunt Margaret commanded from her position on the velvet Chesterfield sofa, where she'd been holding court about her latest achievements in pharmaceutical consulting. "We're having a serious family discussion about sustainable careers, not watching you perform interpretive dance therapy." My older cousin Richard nodded disapprovingly from the antique writing desk, where he'd been organizing legal briefs from his white shoe law firm. "Maggie's absolutely right. You're 28 years old, sophomore, time to put away the tutus and join the adult world of legitimate professions." "Dancing isn't a real profession," Aunt Margaret announced with the condescending laughter of someone who'd just closed a $50 million pharmaceutical merger. "It's what little girls do before they discover boys in makeup. Grown women don't leap around in tights and call it a career path." The familiar weight of their collective dismissal settled over the living room like dust on forgotten ballet slippers. This intervention had been building throughout our monthly family gathering, their growing concern about my Peter Pan complex, their increasingly pointed suggestions that I consider age-appropriate career transitions, their barely concealed embarrassment when professional contacts asked about their youngest family member's occupation. "Sophia," my mother continued from her position at the marble-topped bar cart, where she'd been preparing afternoon cocktails despite her supposed focus on the intervention, "your father and I have been patient with these artistic pursuits, but it's time for some practical planning. Richard just made senior partner. Margaret's consulting firm is expanding internationally and you're, what? Taking dance classes and hoping someone discovers you." "I don't take dance classes," I replied quietly, not breaking my fluid movement through a sequence that would eventually become the signature choreography for a Tony Award-winning musical. "I develop comprehensive movement vocabularies for large-scale theatrical productions." "That sounds even more ridiculous," my father interjected from his wingback chair, where he'd been reviewing financial portfolios despite officially being retired from his investment banking career. "Movement vocabularies? Sophia, you're describing elaborate ways to avoid getting a real job that contributes meaningfully to society." The accusation hung in the pristine air like the scent from mother's imported orchids. I could feel their collective gaze boring into me, waiting for the admission they expected, that my dance career was indeed adolescent fantasy, that I was avoiding adult responsibilities, that I was ready to accept their generous offers to help me find substantial employment in their respective industries. "Consider your realistic options," Richard pressed, his legal expertise lending authority to his voice. "I could introduce you to people in corporate communications who need event coordinators. Margaret knows pharmaceutical companies that need presentation specialists for medical conferences. Even Dad still has connections in finance who could use someone with your physical coordination for client entertainment planning." I might have responded, might have tried once again to explain that my work was more sophisticated than they imagined, more valuable than they assumed, but the ornate doorbell chimed through the townhouse with a sound that made my pulse quicken with anticipation rather than dread. "I'll get it," I said softly, grateful for the interruption to what had become a predictably painful family critique session. I opened the heavy wooden door to find a familiar figure standing on the limestone steps. Someone my family would never recognize despite his immense influence over global theatrical entertainment. "Miss Chen," the visitor said with the warm smile I'd come to associate with successful creative collaborations. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I replied, though I could hear my family's conversation continuing in the living room behind me. "Please come in." As we walked toward the living room, I could see my family's curious faces turning toward us, clearly wondering who had arrived unannounced at their carefully orchestrated intervention. "Everyone," I said calmly, "I'd like you to meet someone who's been working with me on various projects." The visitor stepped forward with professional confidence. "Good afternoon. I'm here because we need Sophia's immediate approval for several time-sensitive matters. The board meeting concluded this morning, and we require her authorization for the $1.5 billion theater empire expansion." The living room fell silent as if someone had suddenly muted the world. Aunt Margaret's pharmaceutical consulting contracts slipped from her hands. Richard's legal briefs scattered across the writing desk. My parents' cocktail preparation ceased entirely. Which specific productions? I asked, moving into a graceful releve as if this conversation were occurring during any ordinary rehearsal. The international touring shows or the new venue acquisitions? Both actually. Plus the streaming platform integration and the dance education initiative expansions. Your creative strategy team has mapped out the complete global theatrical consolidation, and we need your signature before the Tony Awards announcements next week. His voice carried the urgency of someone managing billion-dollar time-sensitive entertainment deals. Sophia, this expansion officially makes Celestial Theatre Holdings the largest independent theatrical production company in the world. Dad's investment portfolios lay forgotten in his lap. Margaret's pharmaceutical merger documents scattered across the sofa as her hands went completely limp. Richard had frozen mid-gesture, his legal expertise apparently insufficient for processing entertainment industry realities of this magnitude. And the choreographic integration timeline for the upcoming season? I continued, transitioning into a fluid grand battement sequence as if discussing weekend plans rather than reshaping the entire global theater landscape. 18 months for full artistic merger. Your existing portfolio. The production companies, the theater venues, the training academies. Everything flows together seamlessly. The board estimates this brings your total theatrical market control to approximately 71% of all globally distributed stage entertainment. I allowed myself a small smile, one that I made sure reached every corner of the now silent living room. The show continues, I said clearly, punctuating the statement with a perfect curtsy that somehow managed to seem both gracious and definitively powerful. Excellent. Oh, and Sophia, congratulations on officially becoming the youngest person ever to control a theatrical empire worth $4.3 billion. Those silly dance moves are projected to generate $890 million in global entertainment revenue this quarter alone. The visitor gathered his materials and prepared to leave, but the impact of his words continued to reverberate through the stunned silence of the Upper East Side townhouse. That was about my theater empire, I said conversationally after he'd departed, returning to my choreographic work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Apparently, the board approved my $1.5 billion global theatrical acquisition. It officially makes Celestial Theatre Holdings the largest independent production company worldwide. Mother's crystal martini glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor with a sound like breaking assumptions about artistic careers and financial success. Your theater empire? Margaret whispered, her pharmaceutical consulting expertise apparently failing her completely in the face of entertainment industry realities. Theatrical entertainment conglomerate, primarily. I own controlling interests in Lincoln Center Productions, the Schubert Organization, Cameron Mackintosh Ltd., and most of the major independent theater companies globally. I continued moving through my choreography with practiced precision. Those silly dance moves you mentioned? Last quarter they generated approximately $340 million in global theatrical revenue. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room as my family processed this information with varying degrees of shock and complete disbelief. The Upper East Side townhouse suddenly seemed less impressive against the backdrop of a $4.3 billion entertainment empire built on the very art form they'd consistently dismissed. But you live in that small studio apartment in Chelsea, Richard managed weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tax efficiency and creative inspiration, I explained patiently while executing a perfect arabesque. Also, the Chelsea location is actually a converted warehouse complex that houses my main rehearsal studios, costume design facilities, and the headquarters for Celestial Theatre Holdings. The neighborhood provides constant artistic stimulation. Dad was staring at his financial research as if it had suddenly become completely irrelevant to understanding real wealth creation. Celestial Theatre Holdings. That's the company behind most of the theatrical productions you see on Broadway, the West End, and international touring circuits, yes. I smiled, continuing to work on movement sequences. The choreography I was developing when you interrupted? The producers paid $67 million for exclusive global performance rights before I even finished mapping the complete movement vocabulary. The living room felt smaller now, the expensive antique furniture seeming less impressive against the backdrop of a multi-billion-dollar entertainment empire. My successful family looked like visitors in their own intervention, uncertain and displaced by revelations that completely redefined everything they thought they knew about artistic value and economic impact. "This has to be some kind of elaborate mistake," Margaret said, her voice rising with panic that seemed completely inappropriate for a successful pharmaceutical consultant. "Sophia, you can't just own Broadway theaters. That's not how the entertainment world actually works. You dance around in leotards. I create kinesthetic intellectual property that gets developed into globally distributed theatrical content," I corrected mildly while transitioning into a complex floor sequence. "The movements you dismissed as childish prancing? They're the foundation of an entertainment empire that reaches approximately 47 million audience members annually across 6 continents." Richard was pacing now, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood in an increasingly frantic rhythm. Wait. If you own controlling interests in these theater companies, then you..." His legal expertise was finally catching up with the staggering implications. "You decide which shows get produced. You control what gets performed on Broadway and internationally. I chair the Global Creative Committee actually. We evaluate approximately 8,000 theatrical proposals annually and approve about 450 for production across all our entertainment divisions worldwide." I captured his expression in my memory. The precise moment when someone realizes they've been completely wrong about everything they thought they understood. Those productions then generate revenue through ticket sales, touring contracts, licensing deals, and merchandising agreements that I also directly oversee. Mother had gone completely pale, her Upper East Side socialite composure finally cracking under the weight of these revelations. "Sophia, honey, if this is actually true, if you really own all these theater companies, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were wasting your life on dance fantasies?" The question hung in the living room air like expensive perfume, heavy and completely unavoidable. I looked at each of them in turn. My successful, accomplished family who had spent years trying to redirect my apparently meaningless artistic pursuits toward something they considered more substantial. "Tell you what exactly?" I asked quietly while flowing through a sequence that would eventually employ 340 dancers across 12 countries. "That every time I tried to share something I was excited about, you called it silly moves? That when I mentioned working with major choreographers, you assumed I meant taking advanced classes? That when I talked about my production meetings, you suggested I consider teaching dance to children instead of prancing around professionally?" "But Sophia," Richard interjected, his legal instincts finally beginning to engage with the reality of my success, "surely you could have been more explicit about the actual scope of your achievements." "Like when?" I challenged while executing a particularly complex lift sequence. "Like 18 months ago when I mentioned the Tony Award nominations and Margaret told me to stop fantasizing about working with real theatrical professionals? Or last Christmas when I discussed my London meetings, and you all assumed I was talking about auditioning for West End chorus positions." Dad stopped reviewing his financial portfolios, his face flushing with embarrassment as the memory surfaced. "You're telling me that when you said you were working on dance projects, you actually meant you were running theatrical conglomerates worth billions of dollars?" "I meant exactly what I said. You're the ones who decided it meant something smaller and less significant." I returned to my choreography, adding movements that would eventually influence dance education curricula globally. "The same way you decided my rehearsal time was therapeutic hobby activity instead of billion-dollar content creation and artistic direction." Margaret dropped her medicine samples, hands shaking. "Sophia, this is billions. People don't just build empires by accident. They do when their families are too busy mocking art careers to notice," I said, arranging new dance sequences for millions of viewers. "I even invited you all to my first big tour years ago." Mother gasped. "We said we were busy with work." "Yes." Richard had a client dinner. Margaret had a pharma event. Dad had investment meetings. So I celebrated alone, with New York and London's top theater executives. The room felt heavy. Dad spoke softly. "We didn't know the scope." "Explain what?" "That my Dance fantasies now employ 15,000 people worldwide. I glanced at my Cartier watch, one of only 9 given to leaders of $1 billion entertainment companies. Richard whispered, "That watch. Recognition for integrating all live performance platforms," I said. "It represents 73 million shows a year across 49 countries." Mother cried. "We thought you weren't doing real work." "Celestial Theater Holdings is worth $5.7 billion, I said gently. "We're moving into VR shows and AI-driven choreography." Silence. Richard muttered, "5.7 billion, from dance?" "From global live performance," I corrected, gathering my notes. "Our shows run in 127 countries, 73 languages. Offices in LA, London, Tokyo, Sydney, Toronto, Sao Paulo, and Mumbai." I paused at the door. "The sad part, I wanted to share all this with you. But every time you said dancing isn't a real job." Outside, my assistant waited with contracts. My phone buzzed with deals and congratulatory calls. Messages from family begged me to come back. I turned it to silent. I had an empire to run.